We're being joined by Chukwu, who is the CEO, Cowry Asset Management Limited, to talk about this. Thank you so much, Mr. Chukwu, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Now, the presidency and legislature gave reasons for the increases in the 2025 appropriation bill. How justified are their explanations?
Well, I think the issue is not how to justify our explanations because the government will always justify its expenditure. Take, for instance, the federal government's initial increase about 4.5 trillion. The government said they're going to put money for the Bank of Industries, Bank of Agriculture, solid minerals, critical infrastructure. So, I mean, on paper, that looks plausible. So it's not an issue of whether it can be justified. The intention to put in money to cover up for the shortfall that will, as a result of the U.S. pulling back U.S. AID, canceling U.S. AID, it's also on paper justified. But the question is only that, could we have adjusted some of the previously budgeted expenses so as to keep the budget expenditure at a level that is fundable? Because the reality is that the projected revenues of the government, about 40 trillion, looks quite optimistic, might not be achieved. So if we don't think we'll achieve the revenue projections, the option we had was not just to increase the expenditure based on the fact we expect revenues, additional revenues from government-owned enterprises, from customs, and from Federal Inland Revenue Service. So that additionally increase in revenue of 4.5 trillion could have gone to reduce the budget deficit about 13 trillion to the region of 9 trillion, while we would have adjusted some of the expense heads to accommodate any critical new expenditure that came about as a result of the U.S. pulling back from its intervention in the world.
That's quite interesting. This would mean that you have fears regarding the execution and performance of this budget, given the country's history of corruption, poor revenue generation, and of course, even mismanagement of public funds in some spaces.
Well, my concern is not based on corruption and all those factors. The concern I have is that the projected revenue of the government is overly optimistic. The government has projected that it will produce about 2.06 million barrels a day. Currently, we're producing about 1.5 million barrels a day. It's going to be a tall order to expect a country that to increase its crude production by almost 50% in a single year. So that makes the budgeted revenue quite difficult to achieve. And so what I'm emphasizing is that if we don't achieve the budget revenue at the time we are increasing further the expenditure, it then means we're going to borrow more. If we borrow more, that will put a lot more burden on our debt service obligations, will further crowd out the private sector in terms of high cost of funds, and will not allow for job creation if the private sector is not strongly participating in the economy, because they are crowded out because of federal government borrowing. But most importantly, we are moving towards a major debt overhang. So we really can't afford to continue to just borrow. So in that wise, I felt we could have capped the expenditure, the initial for 49.7 trillion naira, even if we expected an increase in revenue, so as to further to shrink the budget deficit.
I agree with you. So let's look at the various breakdowns and the allocations. Statutory transfer, which includes the National Assembly, the Judiciary, INEC, amongst others, would take 3.65 trillion naira. Do you have any reservation with that?
Well, those are not where I have reservations. If you want to have reservations on the ballpark figures, you will be you'll be speaking from an uninformed position. I first need to see a breakdown of what those statutory transfers will be deployed. National Assembly will now need to interrogate their budget to see what they are spending money on. It's only when you interrogate the different details, when you dive deep or do a deep dive into the breakdown of those expenditures, you can question or accept the importance or the necessity for those amounts. So, but what matters to me is at this point is the ballpark figures. One is that can we really generate revenues of region of about 40 trillion? The answer is no, based on our current fiscal framework. Are we likely to go to borrow more? How will that additional borrowing be funded? And what will be the impact of that additional borrowing? The fine details of who got what, we can only interrogate that when we have, if I have those details of how the funds will be deployed. But I must not fail to mention that one of the bans of our budget execution is getting value for money. A lot of times we have talked about repetitive budgeting where figures are budgeted year in, year out. And then whether we have the mechanism to ensure that we start absolute and total value, appropriate value for the amount that the government is spending, I don't think we have fully developed that.
So in terms of revenue generation, you don't think that the improved generation that we've seen from the Nigeria Customs Service, Federal Inland Revenue Service, and some other agencies, including the contributions of the non-oil sector, would make any difference? Is that what you mean?
Well, no, what I was saying in the effect that expected increase in revenue should have helped us reduce our budget deficit, not to encourage us to further increase the expenditure. And like I said, you remember the budget was initially 49.7 trillion. When they now came up with this about 4.5 trillion coming from 1.2 trillion, 1.4 trillion from what do you call it? Federal revenue, customs were about 1.42 trillion, federal revenue service about 1.4 trillion, and then another 1 trillion coming from government-owned enterprises. I said that increase in revenue should not have led us to further also increase the expenditure, because the expenditure was already too high and would really giving us a budget gap, a deficit of about 13 trillion. So it's not that I'm not excited we are seeing the increase in revenue, but I'm saying that the increase, given you already have a gap, should not make you to go overboard and say, I'm going to spend a lot more money.
Okay. Another elephant in the room, I know you've mentioned it in passing anyway, is the 14.32 trillion naira allocation for debt servicing. We need to bring that to perspective. That actually surpasses, recurring expenditure, defense, security, infrastructure, health, and education. And I know you have raised concerns about this in terms of how it would affect or impact government's fiscal balance, so to speak. Now that we're in this state, how do you think Nigeria can actually move away from these fiscal encumbrances with this kind of spendings?
Well, I think the first thing we need to recognize is that government does not have the revenue profile to continue to fund infrastructure from budgetary allocation. Like I just mentioned earlier, that the fact that we expect increases from revenue coming from Federal Inland Revenue Service, from customs, and from government-owned enterprises should have encouraged us to further increase our expenditure, because we need to have a more practical and more prudent fiscal framework that will reduce the government deficit that leads to this borrowing we're talking of. Remember that interest obligation is non-discretionary. Once you have borrowed, you have to pay. If you default, there are implications, and of course, there are implications of the defaulting. So we already have those amounts as expenditure we must incur. It doesn't matter whether it's bigger than every other person. If we continue to borrow, it will be bigger than every other thing we spend on, because we have to meet those obligations. So the appropriate way we take to your question is that, how do we avoid further accumulation of debt? And I have always said in different fora that the government must recognize that it doesn't have the fiscal revenue profile to continue to build infrastructure from budgetary allocation. So in that wise, government should focus on bringing private sector to build, at least at the minimum, commercially viable infrastructure that will reduce the amount the government is willing to build that infrastructure. And again, the private sector also have better value for money in terms of its execution of projects. So that will save us the wastages or leakages we have when in government procurement practices.
All right. Well, though we might not have the entire bunch of the breakdown of the budgets, we understand that solid mineral sector will be getting 1 trillion naira. 1.5 trillion naira has been set aside to recapitalize the Bank of Agriculture, and another 5 billion naira to strengthen the Bank of Industry. So let's look at the agricultural space now. What are your thoughts on these breakdowns for the sector?
Okay, those are the additional expenditures that we have been added into the budget. the 1 trillion going into solid naira, 1.5 trillion going to Bank of Agriculture, and then 500 billion going to Bank of Industries. So the question you ask yourself, how will this money be spent? So that we just talk about value for money. Until we have the fine details of how the money will be spent, I don't think it will be most appropriate to criticize them on the face of it. But of course, if you look at my approach to issues around supporting sectors of the economy, take for instance, agricultural sector. The government made a mention of irrigation. We need to know which irrigation projects will be implemented. They want the Bank of Agriculture to be able to support private sector farmers. The mechanism under that will be supported. We have dealt with a couple of intervention funds to the agricultural sector that have not solved the problem. The Agricultural Program, the Commercial Agriculture Credit Scheme, that many of them are in default. So we need to rejig how we want to support the agricultural sector. And for me, if I can see defined irrigation project the government wants to do, which is capital in nature, so I can now relate with the amount of money. But then if you are going to do irrigation, are you going to pass that money through the Bank of Agriculture? The answer is no. It will be part of government capital expenditure. So like I said, defined details are not there. So I will not just run a critic based on ballpark figures. But the key question we must always ask the government, whatever is spending public sector money, public money into, we should ensure that it is important, it is necessary, and we get value for money.
Okay, you also talked about a repetitive budget presentation. I'd like us to look at this from this angle. A key discussion point during the budget deliberations was the 270 billion naira discrepancy between the budget details and the proposed bill. So is there anything in the budget that suggests the figures were inflated this time?
You see, those are things, like I said, for you to ever talk of inflating figures, you need to have the full details of the budget. You need to go through the budget breakdown line by line and look at the amount they want to spend on each item and ask yourself, is this reasonable? Is it the amount that any private sector person can spend to acquire the same service or the same asset? So those are the things. So, but I think if the National Assembly has done a job well, ordinarily you should expect that if there are discrepancies, the budget will not be passed until that discrepancy is resolved. So, but if you can, we have seen the budget have been passed, so we give them the benefit of that they have done detailed review of the budget. Until I personally or a few other persons take a deep dive on the final on the detailed figures of the budget, it might be difficult for me to talk whether they've been padding, whether there are estimations, or things of that nature.
Okay, well, for you, what are the long-term implications now of the 2025 budget for Nigeria's economic development and growth prospects? Of course, you will recall that the 2024 budget is still running. It has been extended until June this year. So when you look at this, in terms of the balance between short-term and long-term strategic objectives, what should we be expecting?
Well, I think the budget, being an expansionary budget, is supposed to stimulate the economy. It's supposed to ordinarily inject liquidity into the economy. But of course, we also know that when you have an expansionary budget, the implication that that liquidity injection will lead to a liquidity surplus, which will mean that it could exacerbate inflationary pressures. It could exacerbate the exchange rate pressures. So, so while our projections at the inflation rate will moderate, depending on how the government funds the budget deficit, we could see a liquidity surplus that will counterbalance whatever measure the monetary authority is taking to moderate or bring down inflation.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, CEO, Cowry Asset Management Limited, for sharing your insights with us.